Yesterday we did the fiscal issues regarding both and more generally sin taxes. Today we're going to take a deep dive into all the issues surrounding sports gambling. I'm going to introduce Mark Conrad, who has degrees in journalism and law, was a journalist once, and he's going to tell you more about his background, and he's going to take us through sports gambling. Mark?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, and I feel at home in one way, but how old I feel in another way, because when I went to journalism school, at a different school that's about maybe 4 miles north of here, we still had typewriters. So it just shows you, I feel like a generation ago, and so much has changed. Obviously in the craft of journalism, as well as in the whole nature of technology. And a lot of this will have to do with what we're going to discuss, because in the area of gambling, particularly, there's been a lot of technological revolutions that have led up to the situation that we have now, not just the legal side, but also technological side as well. And it's something that we will also draw on in our presentation. So without further ado, let's just start. If you have the slides, and those of you out there, hopefully you have the slides as well. I'll just go quickly for my biography, because you didn't take your time just to hear me talk about that all the time. But basically, I am a full-time academic. I've been a full-time academic for 30 years. Although I am a lawyer by profession, I teach in business schools generally, and mainly full-time at Fordham University's graduate and undergraduate schools of business, which are now the Gabelli Schools of Business, both in the Bronx and in Lincoln Center. And among other classes that I've taught various classes dealing with sports, the sports business, sports law, not only, of course, at Fordham, but also I've adjuncted at Columbia's program, and also at St. John's Law School, for those of you outside of New York, that's in Queens. And I've also spoke and will speak again this year at Northwestern University in Doha, Qatar, dealing with the World Cup, dealing with issues there too, and that's another series of issues for another day, which we'll get into that as well. I have written books on the sports business. I have one that was published now almost 2 years ago on the business of sport, and you can take a look at Amazon if you wish to peruse it. It goes through various aspects of the business of sports on various topics, from basically professional, amateur, taxes, international, domestic issues, and the like. It's a fascinating business, and as was said, Mr. Craig said, basically beforehand I was a journalist for several years before I went into teaching, and you see where I went to school. So anyhow, so let's talk about gambling. And throughout our discussion, while we do have the slides, we'll break in, and certainly if you have questions, please ask the questions. And also, I want to emphasize not so much on the classic story of how gambling is now able to be legal, but really what journalists should look to, what the press has missed so far in some of the coverage dealing with this issue. And also the inherent complexity of dealing with an issue that's really a province of states. As of now, the federal government is not in the gambling business as it could be. So the real action is a state-by-state situation. And so let's talk about the history. Basically, before 1992, state law controlled gambling, and still does. Every state has some provision in its law that defines what illegal gambling is. And that's the key here, illegal gambling. Because you do get the argument by a number of people saying the stock market is gambling. Options are gambling. Yes, but they're legal gambling. You can invest your money in a risky stock. There's nothing illegal about it. It's regulated in a number of ways. But the gambling that we are referring to, betting on sports in particular, but it could be betting based on cards and other games of chance, traditionally has been illegal in most of the country. The hard part is, of course, how states define that, and that's something we're going to discuss right now, because states can define it differently. Essentially, gambling is a game of chance. That's easy enough. A lottery is gambling. And a lottery is a classic form of gambling because there's no skill in the lottery. you pick 6 numbers at random. What anybody tells you, saying, oh, some numbers have a better chance than other numbers, is nonsensical, because essentially it's totally a game of chance. If you had it doctored that way, that some numbers were better than others, it would be a fraud. So that's your classic gambling, and that, unless the state legalizes it, and many states have in the last 40 years, it would be clearly a game of chance. But then you look at poker, or you look at horse racing, and games of that sort. Yes, there is chance, but there's also some skill. If I were to play against skilled poker players, I would lose an awful lot of money very quickly. There is a skill involved, and the interrelationship of the skill and the chance what makes this very difficult, and how states approach it. So, for example, New York defines the contest of chance as any game, scheme, device, etc., in which the outcome depends to a material degree on chance, which basically says that a game of a lot of skill could still be illegal in New York as illegal gambling, because it still has a material element of chance. It doesn't say there's more chance than skill. It's saying it's a material element. And that's a pretty tough burden. So if anybody plays daily fantasy sports, it's had a rocky history in New York, because someone said, well, yes, there's skill, but there's a material amount of chance, hence it could be illegal gambling. That would not necessarily be the case in other states. So Arizona has a somewhat different definition, which you have here, basically obtaining a benefit. They're looking at benefit from a game of chance, or skill, or in a future contingent event, but not a bona fide business transaction. Different approach. Tennessee, risking anything of value for a profit, whose return is in any degree contingent on chance. It's even tougher than New York. And you have Arkansas, you have there the risking of money between 2 or more on a contest of chance of any kind, but one loses and one wins. Very different approaches that states have in terms of defining what gambling is. And because gambling traditionally was something that states decided under basically the health and welfare and police powers of the states under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, the states really dictated what gambling was and whether it could be legal, or how much of it could be legal. So, on top of different definitions, basically there are also different standards to determine if the game is a game of chance or not. Most states, even within that definition, say, what's the predominant purpose of the game? Basically, if it's more chance than skill, it's gambling and arguably illegal. Some states, like New York, say any chance, not a number of chance, that any bit of chance, that as long as there's a material element of chance, it could be illegal. Much tougher. And then we have a third element, which is really unclear. I don't know how many states really have adopted this, called the gambling instinct test. This looks to the nature of the gambling to determine if it's gambling or not. It's a smell test. Does it smell like gambling? If it does, it's gambling. I don't think that many states have adopted their test. It's really the first 2 that are more alike. So if you're covering this issue at a state level, you really see how different these states approach this issue, and that's why different kinds of games were legal or illegal in different states. And the regiments, even now, in a post-Supreme Court environment, a post-Murphy environment, we'll see how states are going to differ in their approaches on legalized sports gambling, which is a genre of gambling. So clearly, in the old days, sports gambling would be illegal, because sports gambling certainly would have a lot of elements of chance, no matter what standard it would be, unless a state would decide to legalize sports gambling, which until recently would be not in the picture for political, social, and moral reasons. Now, where does the federal government get involved in this area? Traditionally, the federal government didn't. There's certainly a history of gambling in sports, and the sports leagues, the NCAA, and just about any sports organization, the United States Olympic Committee, were against gambling. And the biggest reason they were against gambling had to do with the integrity of the sport. Because from time to time, if any of you are sports fans, in American sports history, there have been some serious gambling scandals. Baseball fans may know about the Black Sox scandal in 1919. when it was alleged that 8 members of the Chicago White Sox took money from gamblers to basically tank the World Series. Apparently, it's pretty much assumed that that had happened. But more recently, the biggest gambling issues occurred in college basketball in regarding to point shaving scandals. Now, point shaving, does everybody know what point shaving is? Or not? Okay. What point shaving was a system to create odds in a way when you're betting on basketball, where a dominant team is more likely to win than a weaker team, so there's not really much of a challenge to bet. But you calculate that the dominant team is so much better than the weaker team and has to win by so many points to win the game, win the bet. So if, let's say, Louisville is a 10-point favorite over Mississippi, they have to win by 11 points for you to win if you bet on Louisville. If you bet on Mississippi, Mississippi could win, that would be great, or they could lose up to 10 or 9 points and you still win the bet. It creates a fairer series of odds and would make people bet more. Now the newspapers used to post the lines and say these were the favorites, these were not, and people would bet. And they would bet illegally because it was illegal. And the history of this started in a very funny area. You think, anybody watch The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which is that series? Okay. Well, you see a scene in the Catskills there, in a resort. I'm not going to go into too much detail. It's still on if you want to watch it in the 1950s. And they talk about the games they were. This was a resort, for those of you who don't know, an area about an hour from the city, mainly for Jewish New Yorkers who would come in August when it was hot and humid and go to these resorts. And they would have these various activities, including certain kind of pickup basketball games where you could bet. And it would be all crude ways of doing it, like in other words, the players would say, you know what, if the game score, 2 scores add up to 150, you win the bet, or he puts $1 in, that kind of thing. And you know, it could win some money, it was kind of fun. But apparently some organized crime people got to see that, and if you were a very good bettor, you could make a lot of money doing this. And also you could recruit players from the colleges, is what they used to get, to play up there and say, hey, look, now you're back in New York, you're at Madison Square Garden playing college basketball, and say, look, we will pay you not to lose, but not to win by so much. That was the thing. And the city was rocked with these scandals in the 1950s and then other schools since then too. It's not only a New York City thing, but it wrecked college basketball in New York City because I went to City College, it's my undergraduate alma mater, the only school that ever won the NCAA and the NIT the same year. You could do that at that time. Only one. And unfortunately, it was caught that some of the players took money to fix games. And that was really it for college basketball in New York City for a long time. It wrecked the industry. A scandal like that could wreck an industry, and sports knew that. Because after that, you just didn't have big-time basketball in the city. It used to be that, for those of you, the Madison Square Garden would have college games on Saturdays, and the Knicks would be relegated to the 69th Street Armory. That's what it was like. It was nuts. But that's all gone. And these betting scandals did that. It also expanded to other parts of the country, too. Boston College had a betting scandal in the late 1970s, and maybe other schools as well. So the idea behind, even allowing legalized gambling, the thought was this would lead to more corruption. And it was very much entrenched both on the state level and then on the federal level, because in the late 80s, early 90s, Senator Bill Bradley was a senator from New Jersey and a former NBA player for the Knicks, spearheaded a federal role to limit sports gambling. And that's where we had ultimately passed, which I'll talk about, and other laws before that which came about that I should move on now. Before the anti-gambling law, there are a couple of laws that, just quickly, are still on the books and still in effect, even today. And one is the Wire Act. The Wire Act was passed by Congress at the behest of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who fought a war on organized crime when he was in that office. and it prohibits the use of wire communication facilities for the transmission of bets. So you couldn't transmit betting interstate by wire. By wire is not defined, but in the world of 1961, pretty much we're talking about telephone, telegraph. That's the technologies in effect at the time. Maybe cable television, if indeed it existed in the limited form at that time. So it really had an interstate or federal role in trying to limit that, with one interesting exception: newspapers. Newspaper reporters could call to the phone to give the betting lines so they could publish them. That was exempted under the law. But it is still good law, and it is one of the reasons why now, even with legalized gambling in 8 states, you cannot bet from out of state. In none of the states you could bet from out of state because they're concerned about Wire Act effect. There's been an Attorney General's opinion a few years ago that the internet is a wired communication. I think it's a good assumption to make that it is, even though it didn't exist back then. So if New Jersey has legalized sports betting, you cannot bet from New York. It's going to geo-block your computer. Don't try it, you'll see. It will not allow you to do a bet out of state.
They told me, when I said we did this earlier, they were convinced you could get around it.
You know what? There's always a way, a will. Now, I'm not a technological guru. You can try, but the companies are not going to want that. They really don't want a prosecution of the Wire Act. Basically, William Hill doesn't want it, DraftKings doesn't want it, FanDuel they don't want it. They don't want to get into trouble with the feds. They don't want some U.S. attorney on their back saying, look what you're doing, you're allowing this to happen. So I think it behooves everybody at this point not really to want to do that. And in fact, maybe the individual bettor could get into trouble as well. So that is still a bar. So we don't really have a nationwide regimen for betting at this point. It's a real state-by-state situation. You're in Pennsylvania, you can bet in Pennsylvania, it's legalized. You're in Rhode Island, you can bet in Rhode Island, that sort of thing. But when New York will, and likely, have a regimen for legalized sports betting, it'll be for New Yorkers, or people in New York. And given how well New Jersey is doing, I think it's a good bet. In the next year, New York is going to have some sort of legalized sports betting. So then we have a law called UWIGA, Unlawful Internet Enforcement Gambling Act. This was the days, anybody ever played online poker? Okay, you probably played online poker for betting before 2006. Because in 2006, this law was passed, and this law is also targeted not at the bettors, it's targeted to payment processors. And payment processors are nice legal terms for the credit card companies. Because if you bet online, you gotta pay somehow. MasterCard, Visa, American Express, they don't wanna touch this stuff after UWIGA. Because the online gambling companies would be in the Caymans. No problem, we have no jurisdiction to prosecute what goes on the Cayman Islands. But if MasterCard is taking $2,000 of my money to bet on poker or sports or whatever, they could be prosecuted under this law because MasterCard and Visa do presence in the United States. They're effectively credit cards, banks, etc. And that's what drove them out of business. So if you're willing to take the chance on doing this kind of online poker, you have to deal with these kind of sort of third-rate, risky payment processors and go out of business the next day, or the government could shut them down. So UWIGA pretty much ended that practice of this kind of transnational betting. And it's still good law, as we say. Then we get to PASPA, which is the law that was in question in the Supreme Court. PASPA stands for Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992. And what it does, it's a very weird law. Because it doesn't simply say sports gambling is banned nationwide. If it said that, it would still be a law today. What it said was, we do not allow states to authorize gambling schemes. The law is really intended to tell states what to do. Why you say that they came up with this kind of cocky-memmy way is because there were states that had legalized sports betting in 1992. Not a lot, there was, and the most famous one would be Nevada. Nevada's had betting, gambling since 1931, and Nevada said, we want to keep that. No surprise. And Congress had to grant them an exemption. It granted 3 other states exemptions too, on a far more limited situation. Delaware, Montana, and I'm sorry, the last state, I always forget which one. They were generally sports laws. They were very, very limited. So it was crafted in a way to say, you know, you can keep what you can, you guys, but no other state can authorize legalized gambling. So it's an indirect method of prescription, as you say in the spots. Kind of an unusual statute, but no one challenged it because the attitude really wasn't there to challenge. The professional sports leagues, amateur sports organizations were very much against gambling. Politicians on the state level didn't want to try it. So, you know what, there have been a few minor challenges, but nothing major. But of course, since 1992, gambling attitudes have changed for a number of reasons. More states have lotteries. The idea of Native Americans, the role of casinos, which I'll get to a little bit later, because that's also an intricate kind of interrelationship between states and Native American tribes and their facilities. And a very important point is really bullet point 4. Professional athletes are less susceptible to bribery. In 1990, the average baseball player could make $800 a year. The average baseball player now makes about $4 million. NBA, $4 to $5 million. You know, these players, why would they even take a bribe from someone to fix a game? It would make absolutely no sense, because players are far more compensated on the professional level, less susceptible to bribery. However, on the college level, the NCAA remained, and still they have to accept what is the law now, but they were very much opposed. The sports leagues were still opposed very strongly until recently, because what about officials? You know, Tim Donaghy's scandal in the NBA, and it didn't look good for the sport and other things. So they were still a bulwark of opposition. But socially, a lot more illegal gambling going on. You know, March Madness. I mean, how many of you have office pools and have bet on the Super Bowl or whatever? Technically, that's all illegal gambling. Even in most states, before we even had PASPA. But it happens. It kind of happens, and it's been looked upon the other way. There certainly were illegal gambling dens in New York, you know, and I suspect in the states that you're from. There still were places that if you wanted to do poker, betting, things like that, in small venues, you know, people knew where to go, be very, very quiet, and hope that the police would not break up any of these venues, because individuals would be subject to arrest, but clearly the kind of quasi-prohibition kind of issue. Starting in the mid-2010s, the leagues started to change their position, particularly the NBA. States have also changed their attitudes. I'll talk about the league changes in a minute. States changed their attitudes because money. The opportunity to get more revenue is very strong. Instead of just raising taxes, generally, here you have a potential revenue maker. States could tax it. States could license gambling companies, which they're doing now in the states that are legalized. And basically, there's a revenue stream. And money talks. And of course, you have gambling could resurrect certain areas in cities and towns for tourism purposes, like Atlantic City, and millions bet illegally. It's a fact. So there's been a sea change in attitudes in the states as well, and as I said, and also in the leagues, because the leagues are now seeing there's money to be made, and it's going to be an inside bet, so to speak. What will be the value of sports teams now in the next year when Forbes does its annual valuation? And it's something to actually look at. Every year Forbes does that. They're going to go up. The value of teams are going to go up. The economics of sports can change. This is the biggest sports business story in the last year. And it probably would be this year, except for another big business story to watch out, is the potential professionalization of college sports, which may happen in the next 2 weeks. We have a court ruling coming up, but that's for another day, another time. So there's a lot of changes here, and money talks. Well, New Jersey became the epicenter on the legal side of all this. And the reason New Jersey became the epicenter is Atlantic City. Atlantic City, has anybody ever been to Atlantic City? Atlantic City, anybody watch Boardwalk Empire? Atlantic City was a resort town that ran into economic problems. Casinos were closing, including one owned by the president some time ago. It was not really translated to be the kind of Las Vegas type environment. And New Jersey's been trying for years on how to get more people to come to Atlantic City, and came up with the idea, how about allowing sports betting in Atlantic City? And I know in Atlantic City, and that's what became the epicenter. I won't go through the whole story of the case, because that's not what you're here for, it's not a law school class, but suffice it to say, New Jersey attempted twice to pass legalized sports gambling. The first time, the court said, no, you can't do it because the federal law takes precedence. It's a doctrine called preemption. The second time, the state changed the law a little bit and said, we're deregulating sports betting because PASPA says states can't authorize sports betting. New Jersey wanted to be kind of cute. Crafton said, okay, we're just allowing anybody who wants sports betting in the casinos or in the racetracks can do that and just apply for a license. Kind of a semantical issue. And the case made it to the Supreme Court against all odds. But it got to the Supreme Court on a very constitutional law type case. It had nothing to do with gambling, but the way the law was drafted. And it was very little surprise that the Supreme Court ruled the way it did. I think after the oral arguments, I think most of us saw the handwriting on the wall. And essentially, the authorization element is what gave the court concern. Because the court said the federal government cannot tell states what to do. The federal government can tell people what they can do and cannot do, directly through commerce power, but not tell the states, we're not allowing you to do this. It's a kind of a constitutional theory called authorization or commandeering, and it's arcane. I don't even remember it from law school. There have been like 2 cases on this doctrine, in like my lifetime. But this court, and a court like the court as we see now, a court that is fairly sensitive to sovereignty and state sovereignty rights, if you will, ruled the way it did, and ultimately it ruled the way it did. And I have just a summary of some of the preliminary stuff which you can take a look at, and I'm not going to go into it. I sort of summarized it as it is. So, and the court basically said PASPA was unconstitutional. PASPA should not have been made in the way it did. So after that day, after May 14th, basically the states now can decide whether they want to legalize sports betting. It's up to the states, up to the state legislatures, up to the state constitutions in some cases. It's an open market, shall we say. And a number of states have already had passed laws in as contingencies for this to happen. That's why New Jersey could legalize it the next day. West Virginia had a law ready to go as well. Connecticut did. So many, and Mississippi as well. They were ready for that. And they said, hey, let's do this. And that's the situation we have now. So the results are, at this point, at least 8 states have legalized sports gambling since the ruling. Washington, D.C. is about to, not a state, of course, about to, I think in the next few weeks. And you see the listing. They are very different. And in covering these issues, they have to note that they're not going to be uniform laws. They have differences. Everything from licensing costs, taxes, differ greatly among the states. How they'll be regulated, integrity issues, which we're going to talk about as well in some detail. How to do that. And so now here's my first sort of question before we take a little break instead of a little lecture. Which sport do you think is possibly the most corrupt sport for gambling purposes?
NBA.
No.
Tennis.
Very good. Okay, that's right, tennis. Tennis is the most susceptible sport to corruption. Anybody can say, tell me.
It's dependent on one person.
It's 9 on 2, right.
Sorry.
That's right, exactly. You know,
Like that.
basketball you have more, and all the other sports you have more. Even golf you have more, because you just don't have 2 players unless it's a made for TV event of some sort. Tennis you always have a situation where you're going to have 2 players. I mean, doubles you have 4 players, but mainly 2. That's the one area. The second thing about tennis, what else that tennis makes tennis susceptible?
There are lots of matches, and there are a lot of people who aren't making any money at the lower end.
Yeah. It's almost like you saw my notes.
Because I paid
Yeah.
attention when there was,
Yeah.
wasn't there was a risk at the US Open, right, that somebody was throwing a match? And the Australian Open,
Wimbledon.
and the Australian Open last year had a couple of very questionable matches.
But those would be harder. It's the matches between number 80 in the world and number 110 in the world in country X in a small tournament. Those are the ones you look to. And indeed, there could be a risk there. And in fact, there is a risk. It's tennis. Tennis has been worldwide has been a big, big problem regarding this situation. And something we'll get into a little bit more. But anyway, the potential for revenues, from taxes and casino licenses, are going to be very attractive to some states. Not all states. I would anticipate all 50 states legalizing sports betting, but certainly a good number will. I think by the end of this year, probably 15. And I'm being conservative, maybe 15 to 20 states will have some kind of sports betting legalization in play. Okay, now, what about Congress? Now, Congress has other things on its mind right now, for sure. But what about national gambling legislation? That is something the sports leagues want. They're not thrilled about the state-by-state situation. Anybody know why?
There might be some uniformity along the state.
That's one.
Because of, it'll make certain states more attractive for players potentially? The team is worth more because of tax revenues or?
Not so much on a federal level. Federal government would not be as concerned about that.
But the leagues themselves might be, right?
We're getting there. I see. So I'm recovering from a sinus infection, so I have to take a break, and that's the reason why. You're right. The leagues want Congress involved. They want a national law. For that and another reason which we'll get to. But at this point, there has been a bill submitted at the very end of December. Right, that is the Hatch-Schumer bill. Hatch is no longer going to be in the Senate. Schumer, we know who he is. I'm trying for some kind of federalization. But I don't know where that's going to be because now the states have legalized it. 8 states have legalized it. They don't want to lose their power. They don't want to lose their, licensing power, tax power, things like that. So we're going to see what happens. But theoretically, Congress could vote to enact a nationwide law that legalizes sports gambling. They also could enact a gambling ban in a different way, which I doubt will happen. There's no political will to do that. But in theory, Congress can do that. So, let's actually break down the key issues. Okay, first, gambling services are not a legal right. They're a privilege. There's no constitutional right to gamble. It's basically discretion either by states, localities, federal government, to see how legal it's going to be. When there is going to be, or in the states that have legalized sports betting, there's going to be some kind of regulatory mechanism that will be established to govern that. And that's important, and that's not been discussed enough. States cannot easily have a magic wand, or they can legalize sports betting, but you have to have the nitty-gritty issues. Who gets a license? What kind of vetting is there for a company to have a license to gamble? What about due diligence? What about integrity issues? Honesty. What about the way the numbers are pulled? The metrics involved. You have to have specialists that know this. And with the rush in legalizing gambling, I'm not so sure that the regulatory bodies in those states are going to know enough about dealing with this. Maybe yes, maybe no. Because gambling is a pretty complex issue. And it's not the days that anybody spent time at a gambling facility in the UK.
They don't gamble, we've checked this out, they don't gamble.
Okay. Well, in the UK, sports betting has been legal. Betting of all sorts is legal. You can bet on political campaigns anyway. And it's done through metrics. So what you could do, and this happened about 6 years ago now, when a subsidiary of, I think Bloomberg came. Somebody came to Fordham to speak. Talked about the latest metrics they came up with dealing with odds. And it was stunning because it's a numbers game. So if you bet on a soccer match, and by the way, in the UK you can bet throughout the match. Not like in the States with horse racing, once the horse race starts, the betting is over. You bet. And they have ways to determine odds. What happens if the leading scorer for a team gets a yellow card? Odds can change. What if a player is ejected with a red card? Odds change. I mean, a lot of it's numbers, and I'm not a numbers guy, but I was absolutely floored by this presentation. I couldn't believe it. So the companies like Sports Radar, which is a company you may, if you're going to cover this, to hear about because they're very, very big in this area, they do the numbers. What's the integrity on those numbers? It's going to be an issue. And it gets to be, again, really a mathematical issue, a quant issue, but you got to deal with these odds. So that's an issue as well. So integrity, corruption, certainly an issue that can really be a factor to see. And as far as the states are concerned, we've not heard enough about what they're going to do about this. Like, are they going to have the regulatory push to deal with, and what they will do with regulatory corruption issues? Because the legislature passes the law, and usually as part of the law, they say there'll be a regulatory body that's going to deal with these regulatory issues set up, and that body makes regulations. And we have to see what's going to be. There have been certainly some regulations already on integrity, but not a lot except in Nevada. Nevada is the state, they have over 100 people on their gaming commission. Nevada's been doing this for many years. Pennsylvania's been doing it for 2 months. Yeah.
So what you're saying is when the state makes the law, they're not gonna specify what any of the regulations are?
No. Legislators don't do that.
They're just gonna say
They
we-
leave it to the regulatory body to do that.
We're just gonna create a regulatory body.
That's right, or there's one in place. Often there's one in place. In New Jersey, it's one in place for the racing authority. They just give them the jurisdiction to do that, or create a new one. That's right. They do the nitty-gritty stuff is done by regulatory bodies. Legislature is gonna have no idea to deal with the ins and outs of odds, integrity, things like that. You can't expect someone to do that. That's why they're regulatory bodies.
So those regulatory, like how those bodies are governed, it depends on like what it is, right? Like if it's pre-existing.
The legislation will say the regulatory body has the power to do A, B, C, D, and E. How they do A, B, C, and D, and E is up to the body. In other words, what companies are going to be licensed to operate gambling in a given state? What are the criteria to do that? Will they be audited? How audits are going to be done? In so many years, so many months? I don't know. But that's done by regulation. Those bodies are very, very important, and the expertise of the people in those bodies become important. How are they selected or appointed is going to be an issue. And as I said, in a mature state like Nevada, certainly the folks that are there have done this. They've been in this area. They have well over 100 people working in that state, because basically gambling of all sorts has been legal in Nevada for decades. In other states that are brand new at this, I really don't know what West Virginia is going to do. I mean, they may have people in place. I don't know. Haven't followed it, admittedly. But that's a concern, definitely. Because the regulations can help make or break the law. So it's a very good point. Any other questions? Okay. Integrity fees, which is something we'll talk about. Integrity fees, depending on how you define them, is a way that leagues have demanded a payment to ensure that statistical information is accurate. Okay. Others have said it's a way for leagues to get a kickback. I leave that up to one's point of view on that issue, but so far the states that have legalized sports betting have not included integrity fees. The proposed federal law, the bill, would, of 1%. 1% defined as, I have revenues, but it'll be defined in a certain way, because the leagues want to get money on it. The players want money on it. You know, their names, their statistics are being used for gambling purposes. Everybody wants a part of the pie. So before we say, that's great, let's do that, one thing we will note, the profit margins for the gambling companies are incredibly low in these gambling schemes. They don't walk away with huge margins. If the profit margin is 4%, that's pretty good. So it's kind of a myth to think that you're going to set up shop in West Virginia and let the millions come by if you're one of these companies. You have to pay out winners. You got to pay for brick and mortar places, if they're going to be brick and mortar places. You have to pay for standards, possibly integrity fees, possibly, not likely, but possibly integrity fees. Pay for audits by regulatory bodies, and even the initial fees to set up shop in the state could be very high. Pennsylvania has a really high fee, licensing fee, right off the bat. So it's not that you're going to see all the money rolling in that easily. The profit margins can be limited. That's something actually that has not been reported enough, because it's really been, this has been reported in some places as the next, silver, Klondike silver strike thing, everybody fleeing, for riches by gambling, not necessarily. So we have the state licensing fees issue, state taxes, and the taxes on gambling really vary. They're not treated as simple income taxes. West Virginia probably doesn't have a very large income tax. They have a pretty good tax on bet winnings. Same thing in Pennsylvania. I'll compare it in a few slides hence. The valuation of sports teams may well increase. I think that is a reasonable bet, because the value of the interest may increase now that people could bet on games. Will tourism increase in certain areas? Possibly. Possibly. I don't anticipate New York City to have that area, but certain places in upstate New York could. New Jersey so far has done very well since they've legalized sports betting. They have exceeded expectations, and I have the figures in a slide hence. So we don't know, it's very early on, and certainly if you're going to be reporting from a state that's considering sports betting, these are some of the questions that you do want to ask. Yeah.
So I have a question. If, say there is a federal law passed that has this integrity fees provision in there, it would still be up to, I guess my first part of my question is, it would still be up to states, right, to decide if they want to legalize sports betting? Or would the federal
law could overtake them.
could overtake that?
Yes, they could.
But
Yes,
they would have to specifically say that in the federal
Yeah.
law.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
it would be phrased in a different way than PASCO would.
So if they didn't do that though, and they just said in states where it is legal, you have to have integrity fees, couldn't that be used as a way to lure talent from states that don't have gambling, sports betting?
I don't know about luring what kind of talent are you referring
Because
to?
I'm saying, I guess that could be used as if a player's deciding between, two basketball players deciding between two teams in the NBA. If one is in a state where they could get a cut of the fees from sports gambling, doesn't that make it a more attractive?
Not likely, and not likely for a couple of reasons. One, as of now, there's no legal requirement to give players directly a cut of sports fees. Courts have ruled that way, and I'll talk about a case on that point. Number two, the salary structure of professional sports is very, very regulated, and there's a salary cap system in place, other things, and the merchandising as well is usually split between the league and the players to a certain formula.
Okay.
So it's not like LeBron James is paid individually a check for that. It would be the NBPA or National Basketball Properties would be paid a sum, and it would be split in a certain way.
Okay.
That's the sponsorship deal that the MGM and the NBA have right now. So there's some money coming in, but the athletes want more money under a different theory, which is not held up at this point.
So maybe something like the states get, or the teams get these integrity fees, but it's split beyond with all NBA teams.
That's
evenly?
correct.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Once the league gets it, they split revenues with teams. The leagues themselves don't keep a lot of money. They funnel it to the teams.
Okay.
So it's really the teams they use, in the sense, is a central office that sends checks to each of the teams.
Got it.
And And that's for merchandising, that's for broadcast rights, for various things. So, it's a very socialistic system that sports leagues have, or a monopolistic system, depending on your point of view. That could basically, a lot of internal central controls that you have that. So I would think, though, in individual sports, that's a possibility there, but again, even individual sports like golf or tennis, there are rules in the WTA, there are rules on the PGA Tour that could deal with that too.
Yeah, it just came to mind because I know certain states, if like the local property taxes are better in one state versus
Yeah.
another, that sometimes lures talent. I didn't know if there was something like that here. But.
Well, I think what could happen if the fan base is increased at a given location, that could affect the player's decision to sign as a free agent.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll talk about the future, by the way, of gambling at stadiums, which can happen too. That would be so. And also, do these laws violate state constitutions? In some cases, they could. Every state has its own constitution, and in many of those states, there are anti-gambling clauses in those constitutions that have to be amended before they can pass legislation. New York was one of them. I think at one time it was. New Jersey definitely had their constitution amended back in 2011 to deal with that issue. And of course, now we get to the lack of uniformity in the state laws. So, here's where you have the differences. Different methods to get a gaming license. The kind of regulations in place. The powers of the regulatory body in place is the questions that were asked minutes ago. Differences in taxation. A privilege, not a right, meaning it could be restricted. Let's conform with other state laws. And just as an example of how different it is, Mississippi has a 12% tax if you win in a brick and mortar location as opposed to online. Pennsylvania, 36% tax rate. That's huge. And I wonder why in Pennsylvania they came up with such a high tax rate. Is that going to really create a legal market for gambling, or will people just say, I'll bet illegally anyway and not pay the taxes, or not be caught? By the way, technically, you have to pay taxes even when you get illegal gains, but the IRS has to know that. The economic effects, certainly there can be huge economic effects. Okay, sorry I didn't place the source on this one, my mistake. This was from Sports Business Journal. There's a source for this statistic. So basically, so far, there's a lot of potential in gambling for people to come to a place where there's gambling, to bet, actually put in money that may affect the state or local economy, and in taxes. It's not so much the taxes on the winnings, it's the taxes generated from sales taxes of tourists coming to the area. They may gamble, but they may do other things. They stay at hotels, they buy things, they go to sports events, they go to entertainment events, what have you. So Las Vegas developed, if you think about it, it's certainly gambling is a huge component, but you can go to Las Vegas, not gamble a cent, and still take in top-flight entertainment. Which is what I do. I don't bet. I'm not talking about gambling, but I personally don't bet. And when we go there, that's what we go for. We get to go to see whatever is happening. Cirque du Soleil. My wife wanted to see Cirque du Soleil. Last time we were there, it was great. I like to see a hockey game there if I can, but tickets are hard to get. See the team out there. So see the Knights play. It's part of a whole concept, and that's what Atlantic City wanted. They want these sports betting to create everything else, and if it works out, it can have some economic advantages. So, anyway, just to go through a couple of the laws in a few of the states. New Jersey, you can bet live in New Jersey at the casinos and racetracks. Mainly $100,000 license fee. So a company that wants to do business in New Jersey has to pay $100,000 to get a license fee to do that. New Jersey is a broad law. Just about any sporting event could be bet, past high school that is, except for events in the state of New Jersey. Interestingly enough, events in the state of New Jersey cannot be bet. Certain events there. Have to be 21, no surprise. And certain employees cannot bet as well, or you can't bet on so-called non-public information, to be determined by the regulatory body. You notice the Jersey law was in effect within a month after the Supreme Court made its decision. As I said, ban on high school and college sports taking place in New Jersey, or events happening with New Jersey teams. And here's the regulatory issue. Division of Gaming Enforcement and the New Jersey Racing Commission can issue regulations within a period of up to 270 days. They have the issue. Now, the original projection, by the way, of state tax revenues was $13 million in the first year. It's already below that number. Sorry for those of you listening on Facebook. I know it sounds louder. I have a microphone right here. Okay, so far it's done well, but, and here's a big but, if states think that they're going to get billions in tax revenue from gambling, they're going to be mistaken. It'll help, but we have to put it in perspective. New York State's budget is about, I don't know, $40 billion, some high amount. State gets another $200 million, $300 million in taxes from gambling. It's nice, but it's not going to be a cure-all for these issues. So it's not that there's going to be huge windfalls on the actual taxes paid from gambling winnings. It's part of a more holistic process of gambling that becomes part of society, the economic aspects of this going there, the tourism, etc., etc. But it's not so much that it's going to be, thank you, a method to cure, various funding issues in all the states. And note the tax rates in New Jersey, 8.5% at bets and casinos and racetracks, not too bad, and 13% online. Imagine this, in 5.5 months, almost $1 billion has been bet in New Jersey. $1 billion in bets, below all expectations. But monthly revenues, only 8 to 14 million, that's not a typo. The profit margins are very limited. These are revenues, not even profits, because so much still is paid out. And so much you have to deal with the expenses of having all the numbers, all the basic regulatory issues, having the brick and mortar. So only the companies who want to gamble that really have the resources, like FanDuel, DraftKings, William Hill, Betfair, if Betfair comes to the States. You have to have a lot of money to do this because this is a long-term investment. This is not going to really have gold coming out of their ears like right off the bat. West Virginia, a somewhat different model. Now, West Virginia is a poorer state than New Jersey, and it has tried for years to have betting to casinos and other things as well. And it launched on September 1, 5 gaming facilities, maybe $5 million in first-year tax revenue. Again, $5 million is nice, but not humongous. But look at the margins here, because West Virginia was more specific. This is the information I can find. 95% of bets are paid to winning bettors. So the firm has to pay its expenses on the remaining 5%. And then you throw their tax rates on their profits, their application fees, and if you have an integrity fee of 1%, you're really talking a super low profit margin. Ultimately, the margin could be less than 1%. So it's a real risk, to make the decision to have, to be a gambling company. Mississippi, there's no online betting in Mississippi at this time from what I read. And it's small, it's only going to be in the casinos, 54,000 in revenues. That's, I don't know what that will pay for. Pennsylvania. Okay, 6 casinos in Pennsylvania, $10 million licensing fee. New Jersey, it's $100,000. Pennsylvania, $10 million. I don't even know what company would afford that. Maybe William Hill would. A big company. Very high tax rate, as we mentioned. I forgot about the local share assessment tax. There's also an excise tax on what they call the handle, all sorts of things. I mean, right off the bat, the sports books will be giving back over 40% of their profits. I mean, they're a very unattractive state to actually do business in. Those of you, I don't think any of you in Pennsylvania, but it'd be something to watch to see how well or not well legalized sports gambling does in Pennsylvania. District of Columbia. The District of Columbia, again, is about to approve it, and the regulatory agency that's going to handle that is the DC Lottery Commission. Don't really know what they can do. It's going to run there. DC's a small place, via mobile app. So this is going to be the first state that's going to have an exclusively mobile app for betting, and arenas. 5 years, $250,000 licenses. If they do it at the arenas, otherwise it's much less. It's actually pretty cheap. So, the question is going to be, as I said, to look into what's the effect going to be on tourism. We don't know. Hopefully in some areas it's going to help. Time is going to tell. It's something to check. If one's going to report on this, check and see from your tourist bureaus. Local to it, has there been an uptake in tourism? Have more people been staying in hotels/casinos while betting has gone on? You know, I don't know the answer to those questions yet. We have to see, and have to see as more and more states go online. Now I mentioned the Native American issue in casinos there. I'm going to talk about that now. I didn't really cover it in the slides. It's an interesting issue. Native Americans, generally speaking, are not directly under state jurisdiction. They usually enter into compacts or agreements with states because their territory has a certain, at least in theory, an autonomy. So one will be at a so-called reservation, you know, in whatever state, is not going to be necessarily part of the state and have a different kind of legal capacity. So for some time now, there has been legalized gambling at casinos run by a number of Native American groups, mainly in Connecticut. It's the one example in this area. And there has to be, and it's been a tricky relationship between the casinos and the legalized gambling there and the rest of the state. So there usually is some kind of arrangement. The state cannot necessarily stop them, but there's some kind of payment arrangement that a certain percentage of the profits do go to a state. I think in Connecticut they get 40%, but don't quote me on that, I'm not sure. So that's how they had to do that, and the states that have these kind of legalized sports betting, or legalized betting areas, not sports, but betting, generally will have to come up with some kind of agreements with the states and vice versa at this point. And at this point, I don't know of any. New York may have the same issue because New York does have some kind of gambling in a few spots upstate as well. Again, in facilities run by Native American groups, and other states do too. That's going to have to be negotiated, and it's going to be something to watch to see how those go in states that wish to legalize sports betting or states that have done so already.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit more about that? States would have to negotiate with Native Americans?
Yeah, they usually negotiate as part of what we call a compact, an agreement on maybe splitting revenues.
Do existing agreements then they kind of prevent states from going forward?
The tribes can make life difficult. They can say, you know, unless we make that agreement, we really don't want that. We can try to put some weight to make it difficult. We've done it longer. We can try to compete. You know, and the states really don't want to get into kind of a conflict there.
Have you seen that play out, or is it too early?
Too early. Connecticut is a state that could play out, but I think they've been negotiating. Because Connecticut is about to legalize it.
Selfishly, I cover California. What's going on there?
Okay. I don't know much about California. I mean, that's when California's not been a player in legalizing sports betting thus far. So I don't know exactly what is happening, and whether even are casinos in California that are run by Native American organizations. I simply don't know. Not every state has them. You know, that's been a choice by the Native American organization to do that one way or the other, and certainly many have chosen not to. These have been some social issues associated with gambling as well. So I don't know. unfortunately, East Coast chauvinism. I'm not sure. I know that. All I know is we have a new governor there. That we did get, and the New York Times they're trying to get a California section to try to get California readers. That's unfortunately what I know. But joking aside, I've not heard. California's not been the kind of place that has been really on the radar in this issue at this time. It can change. Okay, so the integrity fee we already talked about, but as we said in the gaming board, just to show you how difficult it is, Nevada has over 400 people, including 121, that was what I said earlier, in enforcement division alone. How are other states going to really do this? And this is a great quote that was in Sports Business Journal that says, when you start doing sports wagering, now you're relying on the integrity of the game that's occurring in another place that could be halfway around the world. That's a big departure for regulators, because now you have to rely on the integrity of something you don't control. And that's where they can fall down. That's a problem, because you can bet on not just events in a given state, but around the world. And that's your tennis match in wherever one can bet. So how do you track suspicious betting? That's really going to be tricky. And the way, yeah.
Well, I know this is, but what about the Wire Act? How does this have anything to do with that?
The Wire Act is transmitting the bet through state lines, interstate lines.
Okay.
I'm now in Vegas, or I'm now in New Jersey, and I'm betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on one tennis player over another, number 100 playing number 80 on the ATF listing in, let's just say, Bucharest. How are they going to know that? That's the problem. It sounds suspicious. It's a huge number. Why is that? How do you track that? What accusation do you make? It's hard. There's an international tennis integrity unit that tries to do that, and they work with these companies to report suspicious activity. But it's very hard to prove. Just because I want to bet 100 grand on an underdog, does that mean I paid off the player that has the advantage to tank the game? Those integrity questions are going to be difficult in certain contexts, especially tennis, but it could be in other sports too.
Does it work in Nevada? Have they succeeded in maintaining integrity on the match?
Overall, they've done a pretty good job. Overall, they've done that. I think among the sports that are bet there, they have the most experience. Have things gone by? Who knows? But they would probably be better equipped than any other state because they've been doing it longer.
Isn't the concern for professional leagues whether the officials
That's
will be corruptible?
Yes, certainly not been enough written about that because officials were. It's not the athletes, but officials can be. The leagues were very reticent, but now they're seeing it's legal anyway. They got dollar signs, so they're saying, give us the control over the data, and we'll make sure it's really good data. I don't know how they'll do that. I would say, to be fair, the leagues have investigating units in the league. They have usually ex-FBI people working there. They don't want that kind of embarrassment. So you hope that it's not going to be as much of an issue in the American sports leagues. I don't think it'll be as much of an issue as in other places, but it's certainly possible. We're in a new world out here, so we don't know. It's just, we simply don't know how we're going to deal with these issues. Okay, sponsorships. Let's talk about sponsorships and the like. Now, the integrity payment, as I said, in a way is an indirect form of sponsorship. You say you pay 1% of revenues to the NBA said, we'll get you the statistics, we'll make sure they're good, we'll make sure the odds are fine. At this point, very few have been really willing to do that for the reasons we mentioned. But the leagues are trying. They want the control, they want the money, and it raises an interesting legal issue. Is the information, statistical information, a property right? Or is it free for anybody to utilize? The at-bats, the home runs, the errors, earned run averages, attempted steals. These are all statistical information. And when you bet on players that bet on teams, if anybody ever plays fantasy sports, you have this information. Is it something that is a property right? Or is it something that I can compile and just basically give it out to anybody? That was the issue about 10 years ago, and then more recently, in a number of cases, saying that this kind of thing should be a protected property right, and the league should be paid for it. And the leagues lost these cases. They said, no, it's not a property right, it's not what is called a right of publicity right, or a right of appropriation. It's not the same, it's not a copyright, it's open information. You don't copyright statistics. You don't copyright, you don't protect statistics, you protect someone's name and face. And a case that I will just point out, which is a little bit off center but not much, has to do with the right of players to seek money for the use of their names, likenesses, and statistics in various games or gambling schemes. And there was a case in Indiana by a number of ex-college athletes suing fantasy sports sites in Indiana, saying, you're using our name and likeness and statistics, pay us for it. And it went to the Indiana Supreme Court, and the Indiana Supreme Court said it's newsworthy information under Indiana's law. Number one, and number two, it said there could be a First Amendment component as well, which was a big defeat, and it'd be very interesting if other states would adopt that. Because that's been one way athletes have been saying, look, NCAA athlete doesn't get paid, they're using my name and likeness on this game, 20 years later, my statistics, give me some money for it. So far, not successful. So I think that's one thing that one has to look to. At this point, it was a big defeat, for those players. It says that some states may address integrity fees, none has so far. I just mentioned Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Missouri, and maybe New York, but again, that's not in the picture at this point. Okay, let's look about the deals we have now. Certainly, the leagues have been changing. They've been getting into sponsorship deals. These are not deals so much directly with states, state entities. They're for companies. And MGM, also with a big, big sports gambling ability and presence, and hotels as well, struck deals with the NBA and the NHL. They'll have enhanced statistical information, enhanced data, only if you bet in MGM facilities, mainly in Las Vegas at this point. But there have been a few other deals as well. It's a small deal, 3 years, $25 million is small in the NBA. The NHL deal is a little bit smaller than that. And there have been some local teams also that have opened up lounges that could, just lounges, sponsored lounges, but not betting yet. But the future could be that there will be betting. Now it's just signage, publicity. But here's the thing for the future, for the economics of sports. The day may come that you could bet at the stadium, at the arena. You have a little you have your mobile device, you have devices there, you bet there, maybe at a discount, bet during the game, it could bring people to the stands. And with betting, those baseball games in September, between your 6th place team and your 5th place team, when out of the playoffs, can become a whole lot more interesting if you can bet on them. You may want to go to the stadium to bet on them. The technology will be there, it is there. Or bet from your mobile phone, depending how you want to do it. But there could be lounges there, could be facilities there, could be discounts there. You would have to pass regulatory control from a given state, but it's very possible. And if you allow that to happen, the values of those teams, even bad teams, are going to go up. It creates a very different kind of fan base and a different kind of fan passion if they can bet during the games. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying it's a possibility, and certainly many teams are looking at that in the future.
If the worth of franchises go up, does that also mean in the new round of negotiations, individual player salaries will go up, like we did, like we saw with the last NBA, their last restructure?
Not necessarily. It's not so much the franchise values, it's the broadcast rights deals that drive that up. With the NBA deal, which is not directly dealing with what we're talking about, the reason it went up so much is because the broadcast rights deal went up 200 some odd %. That brought in more money to the league, more money to be divided by teams, the salary cap goes up, players are very happy. There'll be no job action in the NBA. NFL's another story for other reasons, but NBA, yeah, money in the bank definitely helps. And that's really what drives the salaries up. It's going to be how you get the revenue in the pot that's divided among the players. Because the book value of the teams is a bit of a hypothetical, because it's only valuable when you want to sell it. If you don't want to sell the team, it's nice, it looks good to be listed there, but it's really big when you want to sell. It's like having a home. Your home could go up, or go down. Let's say it goes up. Oh, it's great, it's double for what I paid for it, that's wonderful. You know, in the old days of Manhattan apartments with double and triple, now not so much. That's great, but as long as you're not selling it, it's an abstraction. The broadcast rights are not the abstraction. That's the money, that's the dollars and cents paid to the league from the broadcast rights. And that's what really drives the salary. Okay. Ohio has come up with an interesting idea in terms of corruption, in terms of integrity. You're considering, Ohio's not legalized sports betting yet, and they would have a certain portal to somehow an online portal to track all bets and track match fixing, to prevent money laundering, identify problem gamblers, and this is something that has not been discussed in the press enough, and we'll actually get into that. The idea of problem gambling, gambling addiction. What are the states doing for that in the advent of legalizing sports gambling? Some states have had a certain fund be set up for problem gamblers, but whether gambling is legal or not legal, it has been an addiction. People have lost lots of money from gambling in general and sports gambling, in our case in particular. What's going to be done about that? Will the ease in sports gambling create more problems in this area? And what will the states do? What will the regulatory bodies do? What will the gambling companies do to try to identify problems and stop them? Consumer protections, what kind of disclosure agreements would be there? What kind of knowledge base would have to be for gamblers, if any? Integrity of the data is always going to be an issue, and that's why they have certain kind of sports radar has been big on that, and a few other companies too. And how you collect the taxes, of course, that's a big thing. Usually the state tax authority is going to be very interested in that. So these are, again, and Ohio's thought of that in a systematic way, at least when their officials spoke about that in a systematic way. I'm not saying other states haven't, but Ohio's talked about that as well. And leading with that, when you do a problem gambling, how do you determine that? Ohio would have this portal, they would track, cross-check different relationships using big data, and possibly contact other states to share data, make contracts with them, share data. And for consumer protection, will there be a requirement to disclose the financial health of those gambling companies? Are they able to pay out the winnings? That's something to think about. Because the profit margins are so low, what protections will there be to make sure that they're solvent and have the bettors protected? And what remedies will there be for bettors who have not been paid is a question. Interesting on integrity, just one other example before we got to tennis. An astounding situation happened in the World Cup qualifier some years ago. The betting with Senegal and South Africa became very suspicious, and the European systems, the data system, flagged the match. They said there was unusual amounts of betting in the UK and other countries. It sounded very, very unusual for one country being very dominant over the other, and also these are not big countries in soccer per se, at least for a European base. And what made it also interesting was that the goal differential in the game was unusual. Because most soccer games is 1 goal, 2 goals. This was like 5 goals with heavy betting. Official then threw a card where it looked improper, a very unusual card, like a red card or a yellow card, that seemed very bizarre. And so they flagged the match, reported it to FIFA, and the match had to be replayed. And that's one thing the Ohio portal would do. You know, it's something like that. They would try to say, oh, portals around the world would try to do or should do. Something is wrong. And you have to deal with a lot of statistical evidence and circumstantial evidence to make that determination. We talked about tennis, and certainly the danger is there, and we don't have to repeat that. Interestingly enough, what tennis did, courtsiders. Basically, these were people who would go to tennis games and report quickly every point, every match, conveying information. During the 2016 US Open here in New York, it was spotted there were some of them and they were kicked out. And now in ticketing, there are limited rights for ticket holders not to do that, to report, call a number on your phone saying, hey, look at this, look at that, whatever. Because what they used to have is special devices showing that their shorts, allowing a person to tap one or two buttons to relay spontaneous information with one each point. So that's the kind of stuff that would happen, particularly in tennis, and they're trying to restrict that. Another issue has not been discussed a lot, hacking. How safe are the systems? How safe is the money? How can hackers, with non-public information, they hack into information, make bets on the information before the public finds out? Player injuries, for example. Confidential information from coaches. We had a scandal like that with the St. Louis Cardinals. Information there a few years ago. Someone left the team, used that information. It's not for betting, but trying to get an advantage. That's a big issue. A lot of non-public information stored by teams. Medical records, internal emails, plans. Imagine if a gambler, a good bettor, had access to that illegally. That is going to be more and more of a concern. As well as privacy. What kind of data from the bettor? The bettor bets on a mobile phone. You know what a mobile phone is, really no privacy. You can see trends there. The company's going to say, hey, this guy's been betting on this phone number, or someone on this phone has been betting consistently on these bets. Maybe that person's interested in horse racing, or that person's interested in soccer. Let's send them information about it. What protections are there? Big difference between the EU privacy rules and privacy rules in the United States. I don't know if anybody's covered that issue, but that's going to be an issue. New Jersey has some regulations, certain consumer information, age and location, and also various apps for, guaranteeing identity, who wins, who doesn't win, that sort of thing. But nevertheless, there's certainly privacy concerns about the information and a lot of data based on betting patterns. And of course, tax collection, we've talked about and spent time there. So, another thing that's in connection with gambling I'll talk about is daily fantasy sports. Daily fantasy sports came about before the legalized sports gambling. Has anybody played daily fantasy? Okay. So, what's fun about daily fantasy? Okay. Do you think it's a game of skill or more chance?
It's more chance.
Okay, how is it more chance to you? Since you pick the players, you pick the hypothetical teams on a daily basis, a strategy, right?
Because you don't know who's going to get injured from week to week and if they can actually get it before
Okay? Okay? So even with the best expertise, nevertheless, you think it's more of a game of chance. Well, certainly DraftKings and FanDuel would disagree with you because they want these games legalized, and most states have determined they're not gambling or passed special laws saying they're not. New York was one of the toughest states, and still there's some question about it here in New York. But they're saying, no, it's really not gambling, not illegal gambling at least. It's a judgment call. for those of you who play those kind of games. But nevertheless, those games can be very lucrative. I mean, one of them, DraftKings or FanDuel, started in a dorm room up in Boston with a couple of guys, and the financing these companies get, unbelievable. The equity, the investments, within like 4 years, these guys are multimillionaires. You know, with NBA investing, Major League Baseball investing, they saw again an alternative way. Some of them have said it's gambling, and some states still have it illegal, but most states have had some form of legality. It'd be very, very interesting to see in the presence of sports gambling what effect that's going to have on daily fantasy sports. And here's probably one of the big issues that American Gaming Association estimates the leagues can earn $4 billion a year in direct, or what they call indirect revenues. Based on a report that came out, you have the link there, you can take a look at it, from media rights, sponsorship, merchandise sales, ticketing. Very holistic, and that's why, in some ways, this has been revolutionary for sports, because they've found so many potential ways to add to their revenue streams. Even if they don't allow gambling per se, it certainly can make the kind of deals that the NBA has made, they can make the kind of deals the New Jersey Devils have made. It adds the possibility of more sponsorships coming in, official gambling company of so-and-so to do that. And the reason that FanDuel and DraftKings still have so much money is the daily fantasy sports side of it, not the gambling side yet. Because daily fantasy sports has been, quite successful. But there is a certain a symbiotic relationship between the two of them. So, sort of wrapping up and what the future is going to hold. It's likely more states will legalize sports gambling, as we said. In New York, four new casinos are powerfully built, probably the next year. Connecticut is similar, we talked about that. Sorry about the typo there. Place, and I'd say at this point, I would say for more information, certainly you can ask me, but basically what I would look for, the really big gurus here. Legal Sports Report is a great website. It gives you the latest updates, information. Sports Business Journal is subscription based, but if your newsrooms get it, it's really become the Bible of the business. It's like a few $100s a year, online and hard copy. And it is a trade publication, so it's biased in favor of the industry, but it has a lot of information. And also, if I will plug one of my colleagues, Daniel Wallach is a name that has been an expert commentator all over the country in this area of sports betting. He's a lawyer that just got into it. I've known him for some time, but he's just gone all over and spoken about it, and he tracks things in every state. I don't know how he has the time to do this, but he does. So keep that name in mind as well. There are a number of other expert commentators too. There's a guy named Ryan Rottenberg, also does a lot of tracking in this area too. So there are people out there that do know that. Rottenberg's more of a numbers guy, so he really knows the numbers. He was one of these guys that I did the quant stuff when I in college didn't do the quant stuff, so I looked to him as well.
So yesterday we had a presentation from someone who's spent years studying syntax. And she proved to us that as gambling has expanded, the amount of money spent on gambling has not gone up at all. That the total amount of gambling money in inflation-adjusted terms is unchanged over the last 10, 15 years, right? Did I get that right? And she predicts that there will be no significant increase in the amount of gambling, that it will just be redirected from the lottery, from the casinos, etc. And this is all hype, as it has been in the past, when states have legalized casinos and legalized casinos, etc.
If she was here, I'd ask the following question. We don't know how much illegal gambling there was. We don't have an accurate figure for that. It's a guess. Because if it was illegal gambling, you don't know. The only place you knew is in Nevada, because Nevada had a legal gambling system. But you didn't know how much illegal gambling was, so you're dealing with a premise that's kind of difficult to discern. If you can give an actual amount of actual figure of how much gambling was shown legal or illegal in America with some certainty, you could track that. But I don't think you can track that, because how are you going to know that? Now, it's possible that's true. My argument would be we redirect it from illegal to legal acts.
That would be the argument that it will be a bonanza. The second thing she said is that what we know is that millennials aren't gamblers, and that the people who are gamblers are baby boomers like me, who are retiring and will have less money to gamble in the future.
Couple of points on that. If you add and consider daily fantasy as gambling, you got a lot of young people doing it. That's number one. If you expand gambling to mobile apps or in different ways that are more, via social media, I'm not saying you should do this, but you may find that audience. It is true that if you go to Vegas or you go to Atlantic City and do with casino gambling, you'll find an older crowd, and sometimes a depressingly older crowd. I've seen it. That is true. That could be true, but we don't really know. I suspect there's some truth to what has been said, but on the other hand, those who retire, even though they shouldn't, they actually may have some more discretionary income, because they have income instead of traveling to work, costs involving transportation, eating out, and things like that, and maybe they do get a chunk of money, not that many, but certainly some could. Because a lot of people who travel tend to be retired. Why can they take these cruises? Why can they? Because they have more vacation time. Not everybody, but certainly a cadre of people can. That's why we get, and I still get, alum of, so-and-so college get a cruise, 8-day cruise, 20-day cruise, wherever. Go there, I don't know the time I work, but if I'm retired, it's possible, so we don't really know. It may not be the panacea people think it is. There could be a reaction if we see more people with gambling addictions. If too many states start gambling all at once, it could be an effect on the numbers, because they won't be enough to fulfill the expectations. But we really don't know as of yet. But I think, to be fair to the person who spoke yesterday, I think a lot of the press coverage was very glowing, very supportive, very rah-rah, and I do think that there are significant issues that do have to be addressed with this.
Couple of last questions.
So I asked this yesterday and there wasn't really an answer for it. But my question is, if there is some displacement where people, instead of doing lottery or going to casinos, do more sports betting, has there been any data to show like an individual gambling in a casino is worth more than an individual like betting on sports?
They're probably, at this point, I would say no, because it's not been legal in many places, except maybe in Nevada.
Okay.
I don't know of any. On the social science side, sorry, excuse me. We don't know that. I suspect, as opposed to lottery, because lottery is like $1 or $2 ticket.
Right.
If you get someone in a casino, I have seen, unfortunately, of a lot of binge gambling, mainly in the slot machine type thing. It could be a bigger average amount, but we don't really know between the various types of casino type gambling. I don't know. We don't know yet. I think we have to see. It's possible that could happen. Just one from one side to another. It also could be that people get sick and tired of losing and just stop gambling and just say, hey, enough of this. It's now very popular, it's new, but ultimately, we just hold on, and the sin is not going to be a sin anymore. Basically, it's going to be like, okay. And on many of these communities can mature, and I say like Las Vegas, where it's much more than gambling.
Any other questions?
How do you know how common it is to be doing sports betting illegally right now? Is there any data on that?
American Gaming Association had estimates. They're estimates. It's very hard to really determine that. They just estimate by basically some kind of figures based on Vegas and maybe a multiplier effect. because Vegas it is legal, was legal, pretty exclusively until now. And just I think by anecdotal evidence, I don't know what the social science would be involved. It's a guesswork because if you look at the statistics, it's between 180 billion and 300 billion. I mean, it's a huge range. So you just don't know exactly, how precise you can be. I think it's educated guesses, but it's just very hard. If something is illegal, it's illegal. I mean, theoretically you have to close it on your tax returns, but and even if you do, the social scientists don't have access to your tax returns.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I just would say one plug that indeed, if you have any other questions, here's my email, Twitter handle. Please add the Twitter handle. I don't tweet about family or jokes or whatever. It's usually legal issues in sports, that sort of thing. So it's always like to have more of that. And if you are doing a story on anything with sports law or business, you need a quote, have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. So if I can be of help in any way, I'm happy to do so. And again, I want to thank you for listening in at the end of the day. And thanks for the invitation. And wish you best of luck.